What is up, students? What a day it's been. What a day, what a day. Well, this is going to be the French Revolution part 2 of the notes. There will also be another discussion page with about 3 or 4 questions from today's lecture on the French Revolution on Canvas. If you haven't done yesterday's already, make sure you do that. You want to make sure that you're doing those discussion questions because that is actually how you're going to be getting the grade for your notes. Like, it's the replacement grade, so instead of a grade for notes, you're getting these discussion questions, and they're also replacing your bell work questions. So, because we can't really do bell work questions, and we can't really grade notes, I can't come around and check your notes, these discussion questions are the replacement for that. So you filling in the French Revolution document, I'll probably still have you turn it in eventually, but I don't know, I haven't decided yet. At any rate, you know, these discussion questions is me checking to see that you did the notes, and it's also me checking to see that you're understanding the notes, which is what the bell work does. So it's kind of combining those grades into one grade, which is why if you look at Infinite Campus, just yesterday's discussion questions were 30 points. You know, bell work is usually 25 points a week. Notes are usually like 30 points, you know, per chapter. So you combine yesterday's discussion, today's discussion, you're at 60 points. And then you also have points for the Napoleon Bonaparte question. So that's how those points are being worked into your grade. Like, these discussion questions are going to be the bulk of your grade. So it's very important that you are turning that in and that you are doing that. So without further ado, let's get into the notes, and then I'll tell you what worksheets you're going to do for today. Okay, let's do this thing. Alright, so the French Revolution, we left off yesterday talking about the Bastille and the storming of the Bastille and how amazingly exciting that was. So after this happens, you have the Great Fear, which is actually the title of the worksheet that you are doing today. Or at least one of them, I think. There might be more than one today. I'll have to double check. But yeah, we have the Great Fear. Right? The Great Fear is this time period in the French Revolution early on after the storming of the Bastille where peasants were just very angry. So they'd go around, they'd break into nobles' residencies and destroy things, take legal papers, steal anything that might be worth money, pretty much just looting these nobles' homes. And this leads to the Women's March on Versailles, which is basically where all these burly, you know, fisherwomen attacked the Palace of Versailles, stormed the palace, killed the guards, demanded the queen's entrails, and, you know, they were going to get vengeance and justice and all of this. And basically, they do capture the royal family. They don't end up killing the king or queen, but they do make them march back to Paris. And that's important because, well, they're no longer in their cushy palace in Versailles. Now they are in a place where they can be controlled. And so that's why that is significant. Right, so the Great Fear is essentially this fear that basically the Third Estate was going to come in and attack your house. And there was also a fear with the peasants that, you know, that there would be punishment on them as well. So there's just a general feeling of anxiety and fear, not unlike what we're feeling today with the coronavirus, right? Right. So on August of 1789, the National Assembly adopts a statement of revolutionary ideals called, and this is very important, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It's a very long title, but it's essentially their Declaration of Independence, right? And that is their main document. On Monday, we're going to be doing the primary source document packet that I gave you. That is, and I actually have the digital file for that one, so I might actually make that to where you can turn it in digitally. But that's what we're going to be doing on Monday. So, this is a big slide here. This is an important one. So the document stated that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. These rights included the right to liberty, which would be basically your right to freedom, which would include really your right of religion and your right of free speech, which you can see are bulleted down there. So liberty, freedom, representation, all that good stuff. You should have the right to property, to be able to own property, because remember the big problem with the estates was that the third estate was not able to own property, and they had to pay rent to all of those rich snobs in the second and, to an extent, the first estate. Resistance to oppression and security, essentially that is the belief that you have, well, it's essentially the equivalent to our Second Amendment. That you have the right to feel secure in your home, and that you have the right to resist oppression from your government, right? And again, I'll say it again, the American Founding Fathers didn't make the Second Amendment because the deer were coming, and the French were not making this into their Declaration of the Rights of Man because the deer were coming. They made these policies because they understood people don't give up power. And if the government has power and they're tyrannical, as it was before this, as it was in the British colonies, you're going to have to get your independence through blood. And you're not going to be able to succeed with that unless you have a proper means of security and a proper means to resist that oppression, aka modern weapons of the day. Another thing is equal justice, and the form of which that takes is the guillotine, which is a new execution weapon, and is the second worksheet that you will be doing today, the guillotine worksheet. So you have 6 questions on this, 5 questions on the Great Fear, and that will complete the French Revolution documents, of which I do not have the digital file for. The others that we'll be doing on Monday, I do have the digital file, so you might be turning that in digitally, as I said. But as I said yesterday, if you had somebody in the third estate and the second estate commit the same crime, the person in the third estate would be brutally, publicly, for entertainment purposes, tortured and killed, and the person in the second estate or first estate would just probably have, maybe public, maybe not, a public beheading with an axe, right? Quick, painless, The guillotine is a new instrument, which you'll see, I have pictures of it later on in this slide, in this PowerPoint, where everybody dies equally. It doesn't matter what estate you are in, how rich you are, the guillotine is the universal method of execution. Right? So equal justice. Right? Freedom of speech, the freedom to be able to speak freely, even if that's against your government and dissing your government. Like we have with Fox News and CNN, they can diss, whichever government official they want to freely. I can roast Bernie or Trump freely and not be publicly, punished for that. Freedom of religion, you can practice whatever religion you like, and pay attention because later on that actually both of those, the freedom of speech and the freedom of religion, will actually be taken during the French Revolution because, well, the French Revolution just continues to escalate in a scary way. Something that is unfortunate about this is that women are not included. The equality of the sexes is not really something, if you're looking for it in this time period, or really any time period before the very late 1900s, you're not going to get it. You're not going to find what you're looking for. All right, so the assembly took over the lands that the church owned and sold it to people that wanted to buy those lands, probably rich merchants and things like that. And they used that money, they used that money to pay off some of the debt that the government had, which is actually a pretty good idea, to be honest with you. Selling government-owned or church, which in this day was pretty much the government-owned lands in order to pay off debts is pretty good idea. That is a guillotine right there. You know, you put your head in it and drops and it cuts your head off. So Louis XVI begins to worry about his fate as his advisors tell him his family may be in danger, that they might be planning on killing him, which is not entirely a ridiculous thing for him to believe. They kind of have him being held hostage in Paris, you know, like, sign this or else, you know. So he feels very in danger, and he's fearful for his family's safety. So in June of 1791, Louis XVI, the King of France, who he is still technically the King of France, tries to escape the country to go to Austria. And the reason he goes to Austria is because his wife, Marie Antoinette, is an Austrian princess. Her dad is the King of Austria. So it makes sense that he'd try to flee to his in-laws, because also at this time Austria is threatening, like, hey, we're going to come in and take it back because, well, we have a vested interest. Louis XVI and the princess, you know, Marie Antoinette's son is going to be the King of France, and, well, they're also, you know, he'd also be an Austrian because his mom is the Princess of Austria, right? So Austria has a pretty vested interest in Louis XVI and them staying on the throne. But it doesn't work. Louis XVI kind of expects people to be sympathetic towards him, and they simply are not. And so they are captured, and the revolutionaries see this as the ultimate betrayal, that he is trying to flee his own country and abandon them, although I don't really blame him for doing so. But they're not going to see it that way. So in September 1791, the National Assembly completes a new constitution, which Louis XVI is forced to approve. Constitution creates a limited constitutional monarchy. And what that is where, kind of like what England has today, you have a constitution, which England's not technically this, but it's close. You have a king, but you have a document, a constitution that limits his power and his ability to do things. So that's basically what that is. It also created a new legislative body called the Legislative Assembly, and they're going to rename that at least 2 or 3 more times. So don't get too attached to that name. Now the Legislative Assembly had the power to create laws and approve or reject declarations of war. I actually think England is a constitutional monarchy now that I think of it, because they have a parliament, which these guys did too. So the Legislative Assembly is split to reflect the different points of view in this time period. You have the first group, which are the radicals, or another term you might have been used would be a liberal. They oppose the idea of a monarchy. The second group was the moderates, and they're kind of in the middle. You know, they're in between the radicals and the conservatives. The third group is the conservatives, and those are the people that wanted few change from the way that things were being done. They were fine with the way things were. And that brings up a good point, that the terms radical or liberal or progressive, moderate, and conservative are not exclusive to any given time period, and they change given that time period. So all liberal, radical, progressive means is that they want something new. All conservative means is that they don't want change. And a moderate is somebody in between those. So in revolutionary France, what came before was a monarchy, an absolute monarchy. So a conservative in revolutionary France doesn't want something new. They want what used to be. And in this context, conservative means that they want a monarchy. They want a king. They don't want all the rest of this fancy republic stuff. In 2020, conservative means something entirely different. A lot of times you'll hear conservative and Republican used in the same sentence or description. And not to say that the Republican Party in America today is very conservative, but again, that term is really relative to the time period you're looking at. So to understand what a conservative is in 2020 in the United States, You have to look at what came before, right? Because America's never had a king. The United States of America has never had a king. So a conservative in America is absolutely nothing like a conservative in revolutionary France. In revolutionary France, they had a king before. That was the old system of government. So that's what they're for. They don't want change. A conservative in today's world would probably be a Democrat from like the 1970s, right? Because things do change, conservatives, they don't want new things. They don't want to try out socialism. They don't want to try universal health care. They don't want to get rid of the Second Amendment because we've had the Second Amendment since we started. They want things to stay the same. That's what conservative means. Whereas progressive, liberal, or in 2020 America, the Democratic Party, and I'm not saying that any of these are negative or positive, I'm just telling you what they are. It basically means you want something new, right? So in revolutionary France, that was a republic because France had never had a republic. It was something new. In 2020 America, when Obama became president, he was a Democrat, he was progressive, and Obamacare was a new idea. We've never had anything like that in America before. So you would consider him a progressive or a liberal. Or you look at Bernie Sanders' agenda wanting to implement, I believe just 2 days ago, he said that the government should, if a company accepts benefits from the government, that the government should partially own that business, which is a pretty socialist idea. I mean, socialism is defined as, government-run business and distribution, which scared the heck out of me when he said that. I'm like, I really don't want... Man. Anyway, even a lot of the Democrats don't really like Bernie. He's not really... he's kind of like Trump. Trump's not really a Republican. He's kind of his own thing. And Bernie's kind of similar to that. He's not really a Democrat. He's kind of his own thing. They kind of just hijack the party for their own purposes. But at any rate, so Democrats want to try newer things, like things that haven't been done yet. So you would call them progressives because they want something new. Whereas conservatives want more of the same. They're like, don't fix it if it ain't broken, right? America is the greatest country that ever is, ever was, so let's not fix it if it ain't broken. All right, that's kind of the logic there. And again, you can... I'm not really presenting any of those as positive or negative except socialism because I've learned enough history to know that socialism is a bad idea. But excluding Bernie, excluding President Trump, who I don't really consider to be a part of the parties they claim to be a part of, they're both about equally bad, equally good. I'm not trying to put any kind of an opinion on you. I'm just trying to tell you progressives in 2020 look different than radicals, progressives, liberals in the French Revolution. And same thing goes for conservatives. It's all relative to the time period and the country you're looking at. A conservative in France today will look different than a conservative in America today because it's all relative to what country and time period you're talking about. I went too far on that, I think. So next we have émigrés, which are nobles who fled France during the Revolution. They hope to restore the monarchy. They would have been the conservatives. And they're nicknamed the French Plague by other countries. And that just to say, a lot of people like to label people today in America as maybe racist or bigots for being against illegal immigration, which... keyword being illegal immigration. And I think this tells us that people have never, ever, and not just with this, but in history throughout, people have never been happy about new groups of people invading their space. It's not a race thing, it's just different cultures, right? The Germans, the Austrians, they don't want these French weirdos coming in with their stinky cheese and their snails. You know what I mean? There's a cultural clash, and people have never liked that, and this is no exception to that. So war and anarchy will take place. The Sans-Culottes wanted the revolution. They're kind of like the extreme radicals. They wanted the revolution to get even more intense. So they want things to get even more crazy. These are typically lower class. The Sans-Culottes are typically extremely progressive, typically in urban areas, like the cities. Even today, you look at any kind of an election map, all the progressives, all the radicals, all the Democrats are usually centered in the big cities. Like you look at Chicago, or even like the capital city of each state, it's usually blue on the election map. Even look at like the countries, pretty much the blue states are the ones with the big cities in them. And most of the country is red, but most people live in those big cities. Like if we didn't have the Electoral College and somebody were running for president, all they would have to do is get the majority of votes in like 3 or 4 major cities, and they would always win. The Electoral College kind of makes sure that your vote in Florence, Kentucky counts, because if there wasn't the Electoral College, they'd just campaign in New York, Chicago, Austin, Los Angeles, and if they get those cities, well, they've already won the presidency. The Electoral College makes it to where each state, each location matters, because people in New York aren't like us. They're still great people, but they don't represent the average person in Kentucky. So it doesn't really surprise me that the Sans-Culottes are in the urban areas, because I think that that's generally the case. More progressive people tend to flock towards bigger cities for some reason. There's probably a psychological study there somewhere. So though ill-clad and ill-equipped, the Sans-Culottes made up the bulk of the Revolutionary Army during the early years of the French Revolutionary Wars. And I don't want you to be confused there. The Revolutionary Wars are not the French fighting the French government. They've pretty much already taken over that, just because Louis XVI underestimated them so much. When we talk about the French Revolutionary Wars, that is the other countries surrounding them, like Austria, who are waging war against them because they don't like the French Revolution. I mean, if you look at it from Austria and Prussia's point of view, or even England's point of view, you imagine if you're one of the monarchs or nobles of Austria and you see this happening in your neighbor country. And you're like, man, I don't want people in my country to get the wrong idea here. We need to nib this in the bud before it gets a little too intense. So in April of 1792, Austria and Prussia will declare war on France. And well, the French need a military to fight this war. So it's going to be the Sans-Culottes who largely make up that army. And it does not go well at first. Just imagine a bunch of like crazy radicals in America with blue hair and armpits dyed rainbow colors, leading the military effort. That's not what it would have looked like back then, but I'm just imagining that, city boys don't typically make great soldiers. You know what I mean? Like if I was making an army, do I want the city boy who's never held a gun or even gone hunting? Or do I want the country boy from Texas who can snipe the nuts off a squirrel from a mile away? You know what I mean? Like, because he's just very comfortable with a gun. He has that practice. So their army is not exactly made up of the most elite troops in the beginning. So it does go very rough. And the Austrians and the Prussians get very close to taking Paris. But eventually they do get their act together, and a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte starts to command the military, and he's pro-French Revolution. So they start winning. Takes them a while, though. So the war started badly for France, as I just said. The Prussian forces were very quickly advancing on Paris. The Prussian commander threatened to destroy Paris if the revolutionaries harmed a single hair on the French royal family. And boy, did that backfire. That just ticked these people off. So what they do is, at this point, They create a new constitution, which officially makes Louis XVI no longer the king. So at the Tuileries Palace, where the royal family is, they now imprison the royal family and are planning on beheading them, just because Prussia threatened to, hurt them if they hurt the king. So this leads to the September massacres. Excuse me. I yawn a lot when I'm not getting enough air in, so I tend to yawn a lot when I sing because I'm just not getting enough air in. So I'm not really all that tired. Called September Massacre in 1792, fearful citizens raided the prisons and murdered over 1,000 prisoners. Many nobles, priests, and royal supporters fell victim to the mob. The reason they did this was because they were scared. You know, you look at how people react to the coronavirus and how they're attacking toilet paper. I saw a video yesterday of a mom that had her kids have to earn points based off certain chores that they do. And each point is a single square of toilet paper. So when people when people are afraid, they'll do crazy things. You look at Antifa, basically a terrorist group of just wackadoo Democrats. You know, they're like also like, it's like I wouldn't consider the KKK Republicans, even though they would call themselves Republicans. It's the same thing. I wouldn't call Antifa Democrats because they're just so far out there that I don't want to insult the Democrats by linking them to that group, just like I wouldn't do the same to the Republicans with the KKK. So yeah, they're pretty crazy. Like when Trump was elected, they started setting cars on fire. They broke into businesses. They've hurt people. When people are afraid, they do crazy stuff. So as the Prussian army approaches Paris, they're gonna freak out. So as I've already said, the Legislative Assembly will meet again. They'll make a new constitution which declares that Louis XVI is no longer king, that they are now a new government body. There is no king, and they are now a republic. All right? And male citizens are allowed to vote. So Louis XVI was now a prisoner and a common citizen. He's no longer the king, so he's touchable now. He's tried for treason publicly by the Jacobins, which were the leaders of the radicals in the National Convention, which is the new group of legislators. Remember, I told you not to get attached to any of these names. They change it a lot because it's France. They give up a lot. He's found guilty. There was no hope for him. And sentenced to death. So on January 21st, 1793, King Louis XVI, the former king, was beheaded in the guillotine. So Britain, Holland, and Spain now join the war against the French revolutionaries out of reaction to the beheading of the King of France. So again, imagine that you are England or Prussia or Austria watching this happen and be like, man, we need to nip this in the bud before people think there's no consequences to overthrowing a well-established monarchy. So England, Holland, and Spain now join the Prussia and Austria fighting against the French revolutionaries. Now this is where their military starts to actually, you remember I said they didn't do so well in the beginning because it was a bunch of city boys fighting. Well, now they're going to institute a draft, which is, that's something that you should probably know what that is, My male students, when you turn 18, you legally have to sign up for the draft. That to say that if the United States government ever gets in a war that somehow magically our military is huge, so it's very unlikely that a draft will happen anytime soon. But let's say that a war started and the U.S. government needed more troops. They could institute a draft. which means that you could get a letter in the mail saying, hey, report for basic camp in 3 days because you're going to war. Pack it up. Let's do this thing. And you would have to go and fight. You're like, that's not fair. Well, of course it's fair. Freedom ain't free. You've been enjoying the liberties and the freedoms of this country your whole life. The fact that you wouldn't go and do the same to preserve that freedom is kind of dishonorable, right? You know, if you would, say, flee to Canada because you wanted to avoid the draft, that's cowardly. You're a coward if you do that. You know, if I were to get, say, the U.S. got into a war and I got the letter in the mail, I would go. I've enjoyed the freedoms of this nation my whole life, and even though I really, really don't want to, I would do it because freedom is not free, and it has to get done. That's just the way it is. And that's basically what a draft is. You know, they did it in Vietnam, they did it in World War II, they did it in World War I, they did it in the Civil War. It's not really until recent history that we have a standing army the size that we do. So whenever a political candidate says they want to shrink the military, just understand that if a big war happened and we don't have that big, large standing army, they could be more likely to institute a draft. Now, before they institute a draft, they're going to ask for volunteers. And there will be a lot of people that will go up and volunteer because, you know, they want to be that tough guy. But, you know, if there aren't enough volunteers, there will be a draft. And they go for high school dropouts first because they are the least necessary to the country. Just the way it is, you know. If you are vital to the nation, if you have like 5 kids, you're a teacher or a lawyer, or you own a small business, and you're like 35, you're probably going to be pretty far down on the list. But if you are 18, high school dropout with no wife and maybe an illegitimate child, you are the first one to go, my friend. So, which I think is fair. You know, if you're going to be an absolute idiot and a failure, you should be the first to go, personally, I thought. I don't feel bad about saying that. So here we have a very funny little cartoon, you know. If Gillette, you know, the shaving company, were to make the guillotine, because their commercials are always bragging about, now we have 5 blades for a closer shave. It says 3 blades. It makes it closer and a lot faster. So if Gillette made the guillotine, you know, they'd have 3 blades. It's a joke. It's funny. You're allowed to laugh. So the draft, the war is escalating. The radical days get more intense. So the radicals will now control the assembly. All the conservatives are pretty much scared out of the country. They demand the election of a new representative body yet again. Remember I said don't get attached to these names. They do it a whole lot. Now it's called the National Convention. The right to vote was extended to all male citizens, not those who just owned land, and this is called suffrage. This slide is just restating that Louis XVI was beheaded. You can pause to get the blanks there if you need it. After Louis XVI was beheaded, Marie Antoinette's time before the block is really just a matter of, it's a ticking time bomb, if you will. So she is tried, and, you know, she's kind of just sitting there taking it until they start to insinuate that she had some kind of sexual relations with her son. And whenever that is brought up, she's like, okay, no. That is not okay. Like, that did not happen. It's not true. And you're just trying to make me look bad. Like, you monsters. It's kind of like, well, right now, I think any rational person can look and see, you know, how the federal government, the president, is reacting to the coronavirus. And think, he's doing a lot better than I would be doing. You know, like, I don't know what you want from the guy, but I'll like watch the State of the Union addresses or whatever, and I'll listen to the questions that some of these reporters ask him, and I'm just like, you are just looking for things to smear him. Like, you are grasping at straws here. Like, calm down and just report the news. We don't need this petty squabbling of your hatred for him and his hatred of you. Like, it's over the most petty things. Like, they blame him for, they announced today that they've increased the production of masks for doctors by like 5 million. And they're like, but why aren't certain hospitals, why don't they have like, because he can't control every single person on the face of the country. It's like your expectations for him are unrealistic. You are looking for the most ridiculous things to pin on him. And that's what they're doing to Marie Antoinette here. It's just like their hatred for that person leads them to just taking it too far and being really kind of dumb about it. It's kind of like when that one comedian posted that picture of her with the decapitated head of President Trump. Your hatred of the person is irrational at that point. And it's just kind of like, you really got nothing else to do than make up weird rumors about Marie Antoinette touching her kid? Like, that's weird. Like, what is wrong with you people? I don't know. So the Queen doesn't put much of a fight until there are charges of incest brought up. In that case, she does stand up for herself and kind of like, how dare you, like, say that? It's not true, and how dare you bring that up? And I kind of respect her for that. I think that's very respectable of her. Even though while she was queen, she was absolutely terrible, and she kind of just ignored the French people with her fancy, lavish hairstyles and dresses. So, I feel bad for her, but I also don't. So she is going to be brought up and executed, and her 7-year-old son will be imprisoned where he will die. So the Queen is found guilty of treason October 16th, 1793. Only 9 months after her husband, she is killed in the guillotine. And Louis XVI was brought in an enclosed cart so that nobody could throw things at him. She's just brought in an open commoner's cart that you'd probably like put cabbage in or something so that people can throw things at her and insult her. The people really didn't like her. There were a lot of people that blamed her for Louis XVI's stupidity. They thought this evil Austrian archduchess has made him stupid and all these things. And, it took him a while to have kids because he had a deformity on his thing. And they kind of blamed it all on her. So they really didn't like her. The one job of the Queen was to produce an heir, and that wasn't happening. When in reality, it was actually his fault. So the heir to the throne, their son, Louis XVII, is claimed and put in prison. He will die of tuberculosis, which is basically where your lungs fill with blood. Somebody's sending me a lot of emails. If it keeps up, I'm just going to exit out of those emails because I get tired of it. The King and Queen had a daughter that survived the revolution, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte. She's the only main royal to survive the revolution. She'll be exiled to Austria at the age of 17. She goes on to marry and lives life as in exile with her husband, uncles, and cousins. She'll die of pneumonia 3 days after the 58th anniversary of her executed mother. And I believe, because later on there's going to be a Louis XVIII eventually, and I believe that it's her kids or grandkids that is a part of, but don't quote me on that. So after this, we have the Committee of Public Safety. In an effort to deal with France's problems and growing escalation of hysteria and just craziness, they create yet another form of government called the Committee of Public Safety. It has 12 members, and they pretty much had absolute power. This is where the rights of free speech and freedom of religion will be taken. They're actually so much against the Catholic Church that they're going to get rid of the 7-day week and make it a 10-day week so that nobody knows what day church is. Like, that's the extent of which they go about this. Like, and the place where things are the most crazy is Paris. The place where things would be the least crazy would be on some random farm in France, on the outskirts, in like Normandy. You know, it's like where the cities are where this is getting the most crazy. And the guy leading this Committee of Public Safety is Maximilien Robespierre. And you probably remember his name being said in the documentary. He's probably the most prominent figure of the French Revolution, so you want to remember his name. He brings the French Revolution into its bloodiest stage, and that is the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror goes from July 1793 to July 1794, and led by this man here, Maximilien Robespierre. And this portrait's actually very flattering. He's actually a very ugly person, not an attractive man. And like the documentary points out, it's kind of ironic because, you know, there's a point before the revolution that he meets King Louis XVI and he's like in awe, and he's like reading him this, you know, letter that he wrote. And then he's really the one calling for the execution of Louis XVI. At the beginning of the revolution, Robespierre wasn't really a fan of the beheadings and the killings, but later on in life, people change. He kind of considers it as a necessity. And he actually starts to turn on his own allies. He has some of the people that maybe even just a year before would have maybe considered his best friends. He has them executed. The executions just go out of control. You see 40,000 people lose their heads during the Reign of Terror, which is really just a year. 15% of those executed were nobles and clergy. 15% were the middle class, the bourgeoisie, which means that 70% of the 40,000 people killed were not only in the third estate, but at the bottom of the third estate. So really the people that are being killed in the Reign of Terror are the people the revolution was meant to help. Because again, you know, only 15% of the people executed in the Reign of Terror were a part of the first or second estate, and then another 15% were the people at the top of the third estate, you know, the bourgeoisie, the lawyers, and the wealthy merchants. It means that 70% of the 40,000 were just commoners. And you're like, well, what would you do to get executed? Well, it's like the documentary said, you know, you could get beheaded simply for just, you know, it was kind of like guilty until proven innocent. You know, if you address somebody by monsieur or, you know, madame or whatever, instead of citizen, you could be like, oh, well, they don't support the revolution enough. Or I heard last week they were secretly plotting with Austria. They're sending letters to the Austrian government. Behead them. They would come out with lists on like a weekly basis of new conspirators. There would be no legitimate trial with evidence. They'd just say, hey, that person doesn't support the revolution. And next week you could see them on the chopping block. So 40,000 people. That equals to be about almost 800 a day, I think. It was like a year ago I did that math. I could be. It's either 300 or 800. You can do the math. I don't feel like doing it right now. So in that hysteria, Maximilien Robespierre kind of like basically declares himself a god, more or less. And he makes the mistake of saying, hey, I have this list with all these names on it, but I'm not going to tell you until tomorrow. And people kind of just had enough of him, and well, they capture him, and he ends up trying to kill himself, but shoots himself. Like, I'm assuming he's shaking, and it goes through his jaw, and he's going to end up being executed on the guillotine as well. After Maximilien Robespierre is executed, you have the Directory, the Committee of Public Safety dissolved, and the Directory is put in place. And this will last from 1795 to 1799, and it is made up of 5 men. and 2 houses of legislature. So you have 5 men, and then you also have like a Congress, a Senate and a House of Representatives sort of set up. And they have the 3rd constitution for France. They really can't make up their mind with a lot of things. Now the Directory is very weak because it's very weak-willed. Not a lot of people support it, and it's just kind of like it would be. What's a good example? It'd be kind of like if you had a new teacher. Let's say that I get the coronavirus and die or whatever, and you get a new teacher. God forbid. But and that new teacher is very weak-willed, and they don't really assert their power or dominance at all. And so class was just chaos. You could be on your phone constantly and nobody learned anything, and then you got to your next history class and you end up failing everything because you didn't learn anything in World Civ. That's kind of what the Directory is. And in that power vacuum, it allows for another man to take it, right? So if you're a weak-willed ruler, eventually somebody stronger and more energetic and more popular will take your place. And in this case, that is Napoleon Bonaparte. He's very popular. He's been pretty much the reason why France is not conquered by this alliance of other countries fighting against them. Napoleon Bonaparte is the one largely leading the effort to keep the revolution alive on the military battlefield, at least. So he's really a reason why Austria and England and Prussia are not in Paris during the revolution. War heroes are popular. You look at U.S. presidents, anytime we've had like a huge war hero, they usually end up being president. Look at, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ulysses S. Grant, Andrew Jackson, George Washington, and the list goes on. Theodore Roosevelt, all of these presidents. Because war heroes are very popular as presidents. And so that is the end of the French Revolution notes. Next week on Monday, we'll be looking at primary source document, and then we will be starting Napoleon Bonaparte, which will lead us to the end of this unit and into Unit 3. And just to clarify, we're not talking about Napoleon Dynamite, we're talking about Napoleon Bonaparte. Although, that's a very good movie. Alright, so your discussion questions for the day, unless I add another one to it, enjoy that. I love that GIF. It cracks me up. Alright, so what is the difference between the Great Fear and the Reign of Terror? Right? If you remember earlier on in the notes, pretty early on in the notes I talked about the Great Fear. It took place right after the storming of the Bastille. So it's pretty early on in this video. And then the Reign of Terror was pretty close to the end. What body of government allowed for the rise of Napoleon, and in what ways did it allow it? We just talked about that. And how did Louis XVI's son die? What disease specifically did he die from? Just a reminder, I do put the sentence requirement per question. I believe I'll probably have the first question be a minimum of 2 sentences. Same thing with the second one. The last question will probably just be 1 sentence. And so that will be your discussion questions for today. Unless, actually, I do have one more, now that I think about it. That's not it. That's not it either. That's not it either. Maybe I got rid of it. Oh, yeah, here it is. So what is a guillotine? How often was this weapon used? And who proposed to use it for executions? The last part of the question I might edit out because it's in the documentary and not the notes. Who proposed to use it? It's also in the worksheet. Yeah, so I'll leave it. It's on the worksheet, the guillotine worksheet. So once again, you're answering the worksheets, the Great Fear and the guillotine, which you could probably answer a lot of the discussion questions based off of these worksheets and doing those worksheets. And yeah, you're doing those worksheets, you're answering discussion questions, you filled out your French Revolution notes packet, you're good to go. That is it for the French Revolution. I hope you've had a wonderful day. It seems I'm pretty consistent with the time here. Have a good weekend. It's good it's Friday. You survived your first week. You know? So yeah, you should have your project turned in for Monday. Tuesday and Wednesday we watched the French Revolution documentary and you did some of the worksheets. You really should have all the French Revolution worksheets, not Napoleon. The French Revolution worksheets done except for the one labeled primary source analysis and or the Reign of Terror, but I don't think I was able to pass that one out to you guys. Yesterday, on Thursday, we did part 1 of the notes. You've done the discussion questions. And today, we did the second part, and you did those questions. Hopefully. I have the hiccups now, so I'm going to leave. Adios.